Hello, welcome to first Great Truth webinar. In this audio recorded webinar, we have Father James Wiseman. He is a Benedictine monk and abbot of St. Anselm to share his journey and wisdom with us with the title How Real Life Can Be. Let's get started. And hello, everybody. This is the first Great Truth webinar, Advancement of Faith and Politics. And thank you for attending this webinar. Father James is with us today to share his experience with the topic, How Real Life Can Be, as he spent his entire life sharing love and service as a monk. And it's an honor for me to speak few words about Benedictine monk James Wiseman. And I'm thankful that I found comprehensive information on Father Wiseman from an article by Paul Zelonsky. Father James was elected as a new and fifth abbot of St. Anselm's Abbey, Washington, D.C. In fact, Dom James has been elected as abbot for the second time. The first time around he was second abbot. He replaced the prior administrator, Simon McGurk, a monk of Belmont Abbey in UK. The new abbot has been called to serve his community in a variety of ways. Since his profession in 1966, namely priesthood, abbot, novice master, and a prior. Abbot James teaches theology at Catholic University of America, and he has done so since 1985, and at the Abbey School since 1969. Since 2007, he held the rank of ordinary professor at Catholic U. He has served twice as chair of Catholic U's theology department, and for a period of time as an associate dean. Father James has been written or edited 6 books and more than 30 published articles. He has also chaired the Monastic Interreligious Dialogue, a collection of monks and nuns interested in questions of interfaith relations. For 12 years, Dom James edited the Bulletin of Monastic Interreligious Dialogue. With that, I open the session to Father James to share his wisdom and experience from his life, intersex prudence for how real life can be.
Fine. Happy to be with all of you. I'm going to talk about different ways of interreligious dialogue. I don't pretend to have anything like a total mastery of what might be done in the practice of such dialogue. So I urge you to sort of think along with me as I give my reflections, and then you could share some of your own thoughts afterwards. I expect to talk probably around 40 minutes. And although I intend my talk to be quite practical, I'm not going to begin with how to do it remarks, but rather with a few background reflections about the nature and the importance and the difficulty of such interreligious dialogue. As a kind of working definition, here's a succinct one by Professor Paul Knitter, who is at Xavier University in Cincinnati. Here's what he said. Dialogue is the exchange of experience and understanding between two or more partners with the intention that all the partners grow in experience and understanding. I think for our purposes this evening, that will normally involve face-to-face encounter with one or more persons, but I think we might readily agree with the prominent Catholic theologian David Tracy, who once wrote that the serious reading of texts or rituals or events is also a genuine form of dialogue. Such reading can only enhance face-to-face conversation whenever that kind of conversation occurs. And whatever its specific form, dialogue opens us up to other worlds of meaning, which are thereby recognized as in some way possible options for ourselves. In other words, if you enter into dialogue, you've got to be ready to change. Now, as you know, for many centuries, interreligious dialogue was not given a very high priority in the church, And I think on many levels, it was regarded with some suspicion. Because after all, if you think you're in possession of the fullness of truth, well, then isn't your call towards non-Christians simply to help them see the light, namely our light? And while he was the head of the Vatican Secretariat for Non-Christians, that's since been renamed the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, a Belgian Archbishop, Jean Jadot, gave a very fine lecture down at Rice University in Houston. And in that, he surveyed the evolution in Roman Catholic dialogues toward other religions in recent centuries. I think it's well known that for centuries, many Catholics held that if anybody was not a visible member of the church, then they had little or no chance of salvation. And I think that conviction on the part of many people continued until fairly recent times. I'll give you one example. Back in the 19th century, there was a missionary in Switzerland, and he gave a sermon to his people as he was leaving Switzerland and ready to set sail for India. And in his final sermon in his native land, he said this, I'm quoting him: "God is calling me from the fatherland to a land far beyond the sea, among savage people who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, and I'm to make known the gospel to them. If I leave you, it is for this reason alone, to snatch them from eternal destruction by the light and grace of the gospel, and thereby save their souls." Now, obviously, I think if that's your attitude toward non-Christians, there really be no real incentive to enter into dialogue with them. At most, any dialogue that did occur in those circumstances would only be something kind of preliminary to evangelization and attempted conversion. But I think you're also well aware that a case like that of the Swiss missionary is no longer typical. I think you're familiar with the huge change that was signaled by the Second Vatican Council's decree about the church's relationship to other religions. And recent popes have emphasized what was already present in that document from Vatican II. I'll give you just one example here. Already in 1981, and this was the occasion of St. John Paul II's first trip to Asia as Pope, his message to the people of that continent emphasized, and these are his words, "The church wishes to do everything possible to cooperate with other believers in preserving all that is good in their religions and cultures, stressing the things that we all hold in common." And to that end, John Paul II went on to make the sweeping statement, and again, I'm quoting him, he said, "All Christians must therefore be committed to dialogue with the believers of other religions so that mutual understanding and collaboration may grow." And I think leading Catholic theologians today are really engaging in this kind of dialogue in ever-increasing numbers. A few minutes ago, I mentioned David Tracy, a fine Catholic theologian out at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He recently wrote, and again, I'm quoting him, "We're fast approaching the day when it will not be possible to attempt a Christian systematic theology except in serious conversation with the other great ways." He means, of course, the other great religions. He goes on to say, "There is no more pressing question on the present theological horizon than the question of interreligious dialogue." But he also wrote, and I think it's true, there's also no more difficult question, because however often the word is used, dialogue is actually a rare phenomenon in anyone's experience. And why? Because dialogue, if it's really to be itself, demands the intellectual, moral, and religious ability to struggle, to hear another person, to hear what that person is really saying, and to respond. And I think for Christians, that might be especially difficult. The very great German theologian Karl Rahner once wrote, "No other religion, not even Islam, maintains so absolutely that it is the religion, the only valid revelation of the one living God. The fact of the pluralism of religions is therefore often the greatest scandal and the greatest vexation for Christianity." That's what Father Rahner thought. Now, I think there's no doubt among the reasons why many practitioners of dialogue have come to realize that real dialogue is possible only after some years of friendship and growth in mutual trust. You can't expect that trust, that deep friendship to emerge immediately. Now, actually, what I just said might sound a little discouraging. After all, if what he called years of friendship and mutual trust are called for, and if, as others have claimed, proficiency in dialogue ideally requires living for an extended period of time in another culture where one of the other great faith traditions is prominent, then what can really be meant by cultivating dialogue in your local area, wherever you live, such as my own monastic community here in Washington, where most, if not all, of the members of this monastery will never approach anything like making dialogue a full-time endeavor? Doesn't it seem that genuine interreligious dialogue has to be left to experts or professionals, people who sort of give their entire working time to practicing it? And yet, on the other hand, you'll recall I said a few minutes ago, St. John Paul II said that all Christians have to be committed to dialogue with the believers of other faiths. Now, was that sheer hyperbole on John Paul's part? Or should we rather take it as a personal call? And I think it should be done by everybody to some extent. But why is this important? And what's to be gained by it? Now, I don't want to simply put answers into your mouth, and you might later have even better responses to these questions than I have. But a couple come to my mind, answering those questions. Why is dialogue important, and what might you gain from it? Because for one thing, interreligious dialogue at even the most basic elementary level can really be a powerful source of personal growth and deeper self-understanding. After all, if we live and communicate only with people whose attitudes and beliefs and views of reality are just like our own, then we'll almost inevitably understand ourselves and our world only from one single angle. Sociologists point out that members of any more or less closed society will tend to think that their views, their customs, their approaches to life are the only ones that count. Now, that can be cozy and peaceful, but I think it really borders on the peacefulness of the grave. Even as the great turning points in the history of science or philosophy or religion have come about when one or another person was awakened from his or her dogmatic slumber and began to approach an issue from a different direction and with different imagery, so too will life-enhancing changes in one's life often come about only through the initially turbulent but eventually nourishing entry of another person, a stranger, into one's own life. And I think related to that is the fact interreligious dialogue will also enlarge our understanding of God's purpose and work in the world. In the past, as I've already indicated, the world outside of Christianity could easily be spoken of, as that Swiss missionary spoke of it, in terms of darkness and the shadow of death. My own scholarly work has in large measure focused on late medieval mysticism, especially that of the Low Countries, the Netherlands and Belgium. And there, the outstanding figure was a 14th century Augustinian canon, Blessed Jan van Ruysbroek. Now, I think there's a much enduring truth and beauty in what he wrote. And it gratifies me to see that some prominent theologians of our own day are turning to Jan van Ruysbroek for insights into the essentially Trinitarian nature of all Christian living. But that same mystical writer also will bring the reader up short from time to time by the way he refers to pagans or to Jews, as when he says, and I'm quoting him here, at the last judgment, all of these others will have to appear before Christ, even though they were already damned during their lifetime, since they had within themselves neither grace nor divine love, and therefore live constantly in the death of eternal damnation. That's a quote from that otherwise wonderful mystical writer. But what a narrow view of God that is, a narrow view of divine grace. And yet, for centuries, that was mainline Christian thinking. So on the contrary, today, we're called by the church itself not only to understand, but also positively promote everything that is good in other religions. And whatever is good in them does, of course, have its source ultimately in God. Some of the people who have gone most deeply into these other traditions have even experienced what they call a double or perhaps even triple belonging. I'll give you some examples. John Moffatt was a Christian layman who died a few years ago. He once wrote an autobiographical account that's really fascinating. It was about his own spiritual journey. He titled the book, Journey to Gorakhpur. And his first words in that book are these. He wrote, I am a Christian, but I can no longer say that I am not a Hindu or a Buddhist. In a very similar way, the late Raimon Panikar, who was without doubt one of the leading practitioners of interreligious dialogue in recent times, once wrote, I left as a Christian, I found myself a Hindu, and I'm returning as a Buddhist, but without ever having ceased to be a Christian. In other words, he felt that in some sense, he could speak of himself as a Christian and as a Hindu and as a Buddhist. I'll give you another example. When the French Benedictine Henri Le Sceau left France for India as a young monk, his primary aim at that time was to convert Hindus to Christianity. But in the course of time, he found himself becoming more and more Hindu, so that at times he felt no longer sure whether he was a Christian or a Hindu or neither. And that state of anguish might at first hearing seem to be an excellent reason not even to embark on the path of dialogue in the first place. But I'm going to suggest that Henri Le Sceau was suffering more the pain of growth than anything else, because toward the end of his life, he came to a sense of deep serenity, convinced that he had actually experienced the truth of the Upanishads, but without, for that reason, having had to abandon his Catholic faith. Now, to some people, what Le Sceau or Panikar or Moffatt did might be dismissed as syncretism, pure and simple. In other words, a kind of state of spiritual confusion that you ought not wish upon your worst enemy. But it seems to me better to take a less harsh view, because none of those persons I've named, John Moffatt, Raimon Panikar, Henri Le Sceau, none of them set out with the intention of arriving at some state of double belonging. Rather, that sense arose spontaneously, simply out of their own experience. And I think philosophically or theologically, it isn't that difficult to explain. Because after all, if there is truth and goodness in these other traditions that we're called upon by the church to promote, and if you become convinced of that truth, even though it may be expressed in language that is not, or at least not yet, the language of the Christian tradition, should it be any more shocking for such a person to own that other tradition than it was for St. Paul, the greatest of the Christian apostles, to continue to call himself a Jew and an Israelite, even as he was a follower of Christ? This, of course, today is the feast of his conversion. And I don't mention these matters in expectation that the relatively modest efforts at dialogue that most of us make will lead to such claims of double belonging on our part. But I do want to bring out, through these possibly extreme examples, the kind of expansion of horizons that can occur and that cannot simply be dismissed as intolerable without first examining what fruit, whether for good or for ill, was thereby born in a person's life. It's obviously not for me or anyone else to predict the specific end results of anyone else's engaging in interreligious dialogue. But what I can do, and that's going to be the main purpose of my presentation, is indicate some ways in which this engagement can be brought about in our own local context, whether it be our parish or a prayer group or a monastery like my own or whatever. And I'm going to speak about dialogue at different levels. And I'm going to start with the dialogue of the head. At least that's my own terminology. Because I think probably the hardest step of all is the first, namely to take a plunge into doing it. And that even that wouldn't be so hard if it were not for the mental inertia and lethargy under which we all labor at times. So the first step is simply to decide what other religious tradition you first want to become more familiar with, and then get to know some persons who belong to that other tradition. Here, I think you could let your fingers do the walking, in the sense, just do a Google search using maybe the word church for a local locality, and then you'll find listed there not only churches in the normal Western sense of the word, but you'll also find references to Theravada Buddhist Viharas. You'll find references to Tibetan Buddhist meditation centers, to Zen Buddhist monasteries, to Hindu temples, Muslim mosques, Sufi khanakas, Jewish synagogues, and a lot more. And almost all of these centers have regular times when they're open to visitors. And if you visit any one of them, you'll almost certainly get a friendly response if you get to know such persons. And from that first contact, all sorts of avenues may open up which could not possibly be plotted out in advance. One of my own friends has been a Sufi, and I first contacted him some years ago. He has since spoken at a meeting on interreligious dialogue at my monastery. He's given some talks to students in our Abbey High School. He once accompanied me to hear a wonderful lecture on Sufi poetry at the Smithsonian Institution. Now, I'm not going to say that our conversations were all that profound, but we certainly came to a deeper appreciation of each other's traditions, and I think we'll continue to do so. And as a variation on this theme, the person whom you first decide to contact would not necessarily have to be somebody from another faith tradition. For example, at our own monastery, we once had as a guest a Catholic laywoman who conducted a yoga center here in the Washington area. And in addition to regular classes in Hatha yoga, she offers programs showing how key yoga postures or poses are conducive to Christian meditation. This woman would also schedule a yoga retreat each summer at the Christian Brothers Spiritual Center in rural Maryland. I also have another friend, a friend who's a Paulist priest, Tom Ryan, who's written on ways in which yoga practice can help a Catholic grow in the ways of contemplative prayer. And following a meeting at my monastery a few years ago, attended by persons who were engaged in interreligious dialogue in different parts of our country, I received some very appreciative letters from those who had attended from other monasteries. One of these was a Benedictine sister, Anna Marie Kunsler. She belonged to a Benedictine monastery in Pennsylvania. She was then rather elderly and has since died. But even during that meeting here at the St. Anselm's, she struck me as somebody who was really open and eager to learn more about other faith traditions. And this impression was confirmed when I received a letter from her a few days later when she had returned to Pennsylvania. And in her letter, here's part of what she said. I'm quoting, "I'm deeply grateful for all you did to make this past weekend so fruitful for me, and I'm sure fruitful for all who attended the sessions. The prayerful atmosphere of St. Anselm's Abbey added much. Since returning home, I've already spoken with our prioress about making contacts with Buddhists in the Pittsburgh area. My prioress was very supportive, so we should be able to make some kind of modest beginning toward dialogue." And another person who participated in our program that particular day later wrote another letter, and that person said, "I feel that a truly adequate letter of gratitude would be difficult to write, but I'll push along anyway. Experiencing the gracious hospitality of all the monks of St. Anselm's was beautiful. It seemed as though they could not do enough for us. Participating in the Eucharistic liturgy and the liturgy of the hours was a unique privilege. In view of the fact that it was my first participation in East-West dialogue, the entire experience was especially meaningful. Studying Buddhism and other Eastern religions through my own reading has already proven an enriching experience, but being with persons further advanced in both the study and experience of the cultural and geographical settings was greatly rewarding. And because I myself was encouraged by such expressions of gratitude, I next began looking into the possibility of some further sessions of dialogue. A Trappist monk suggested to me that it might be good to contact someone from the Hindu tradition. So for that reason, I got in touch with a Swami who had founded a very impressive ashram on the James River in Central Virginia. So I drove down to his foundation. I met with him and some of his associates to discuss the structure of such a day of dialogue. And I later wrote to Benedictine and Cistercian communities in the mid-Atlantic states, inviting members of their houses to come to St. Anselm's for the sessions that we had planned. And I also invited several professors from Catholic University and from Georgetown with longstanding interest in interreligious dialogue. There was happily an excellent turnout. We had about 20 Benedictine monks and sisters, a few professors from Catholic U and from Georgetown University, and we had 4 members of that Hindu ashram down in Central Virginia. Our morning session focused on Hatha Yoga with instruction and practice in some of the basic poses. And then after midday prayer in the Abbey Church, we had a delicious vegetarian lunch marked with a lot of lively conversation in small groups. And then the afternoon was devoted largely to a talk by Swami Satchidananda on the ideal of harmony among the world's religions. And we left plenty of time for questions and discussion, and there was a lot of discussion until the program ended around 4 p.m. that afternoon. Now, again, I dare not say that a single day's program like that was utterly transformative of the life of anybody present, but it was a very positive experience for everybody involved. Obviously, there's a lot of busy work involved preparing for something like that. You have to reserve a room in the monastery. You have to make appropriate arrangements for lunch and so forth. But for the most part, all those tasks are pretty obvious. The main thing, again, and I repeat, it's simply taking that first step, imagining what you want, and then contacting the people who can translate your image into reality. I assure you, it really can work. But I want to add that the sort of program I've been describing is by no means the only kind possible, and is in many ways far from the most important, at least if it goes no further than presentation by members of other faith traditions, followed by some questions and discussion. You might recall I'm calling this kind of dialogue of the head, because it mostly involves talking about your own practices, talking about your own beliefs, trying to understand what others are saying about their beliefs and practices. And that can be informative, it can be enlightening, certainly enjoyable, but it does stay pretty much on the level of the head, as distinct from what I'm calling the levels of the heart and the hands. So I now want to say something about these other two dimensions. By the heart, I'm simply referring to what you might call the common prayer, or being in silent communion with others, maybe meditating together. And by the dialogue of the hands, I mean working together with members of other traditions for the welfare of our society as a whole. But first then, something about what I'm calling dialogue at the level of the heart. And rather than speak abstractly, I'm going to refer, first of all, to a wonderful essay by a man named Murray Rogers. He was a Christian, long involved in interfaith dialogue in various countries of the Middle East and the Far East. Like Henri Lassault,
You have muted yourself, James.
how long was that going on? I'm
Just a
sorry.
few seconds.
Good, I didn't realize that. Thank you for telling me. I'll try not to let that happen again. Don't know how it happened. Anyway, rather than speak abstractly, I want to refer to a wonderful essay by a man named Murray Rogers. He's a Christian who was long involved in interfaith dialogue in various countries of the Middle East and the Far East. And like Henri Lassault, Murray Rogers first went to India as a missionary, regarding himself as a teacher of what he considered a better way, the Christian way. For him, his descent into the Valley of Humility began when he became friends with a close colleague of Mahatma Gandhi, and was then invited to live at Gandhi's ashram for the final 15 years of Gandhi's life. In his own words, here's what happened to Murray Rogers while he lived there. Here's what Rogers wrote. It began simply by being puzzled, by wondering what makes such dear, loving, gentle people. Slowly, I came to see that I needed to place their way at a genuinely spiritual level, at the level of the spirit. I was in the presence of a mystery, a spiritual experience that could only be approached with the deepest reverence. From that inner beginning came the practice of Upanishadic meditation. In the insights of the Vedas, discovered not primarily as material for intellectual scrutiny, but as food for the soul, my wife and I rejoiced to find many links with the spiritual food provided by our own Christian sources, which of course are the Bible, fathers of the church, and the great Christian mystics. We found it natural and good to collect what we sometimes call our Hindu prayer book. Sometimes these are voiced by us as prayer together, while at other times we use entire Vedic hymns as psalms through which we too can offer our praise and gratitude to God. Now, my main reason for quoting from that essay by Murray Rogers was to highlight the importance that he found in Hindu prayer. The notion of using such texts in one's own prayer life might strike some people as something strange, not to mention the further possibility of praying together with non-Christians. But I think it's worth recalling that not many decades ago, Catholics who attended the wedding or a funeral of a friend in a non-Catholic church were not supposed to participate in any active way in the ceremony. Whereas on the other hand, there are now frequent ecumenical prayer services with Protestants, especially during this week of prayer for Christian unity that we concluded today. And there's also regular cooperation between Catholic and Protestant ministers at mixed marriages. The progress made in this regard in recent decades surely makes a wider ecumenism and shared prayer more thinkable. And even when, perhaps for reasons of language, one cannot fully participate in the prayer of a non-Christian community, that doesn't mean there could be no sharing on a deep level. Merely being received as a guest into the residence or into the worship space of another community is something charged with meaning. And some very fine reflections on interreligious hospitality as an expression of dialogue, a Belgian Benedictine monk, Pierre de Bethune, wrote the following. He said, Saint Benedict asks the monks in chapter 53 of his rule to bring the guest to prayer. Well, what happens when we lead a guest of a different religion to our oratory? The guest may be able only with difficulty to make his own a prayer from a universe very different from his own, but he will express by his entire attitude his desire to be associated with the prayer of the Christians. And Christian monks welcomed into Zen monasteries in Japan will behave in the same way. Without understanding much of the meaning of the words being recited or heard, and without adhering to the doctrines which these prayers convey, the Christian monks will nevertheless be joined to the prayer of their hosts. The limitations recognized by both sides and the reverent attention paid to the mystery of each religion will avoid all syncretism, but one cannot deny that there will have taken place a communion in prayer above and beyond words. Now, I think in that little passage from Father Pierre de Bethune, his final remark about this being a communion in prayer beyond words is crucial, because even the most carefully composed communal prayer could never be the pinnacle of sharing at the level of the heart. And I think Henri Lesseau, whom I've already mentioned, saw this very well when he once wrote, "Only at the level of the spirit is there stability, underlying the flow of the surface. Only those who are attuned to the spirit in themselves can attune themselves to the spirit in others. This attitude goes far beyond sharing informal prayer, as may or may not be done at the beginning of a meeting. True dialogue originates in the silence of the spirit and ends in the same silence. Words and ideas exchanged in the interval are penetrated and enriched by such silence. A religious meeting that does not spontaneously lead, at least at the end, to moments of deep felt silence is suspect of having really missed the point." And then thirdly, I want to speak about dialogue at the level of the hands. I've already said something about the level of the head in which we share ideas, listen to one another. I've spoken of dialogue at the level of the heart, when we might pray together and let that prayer even lead into silence. So I'm now going to say something about this third level, which you can understand from the imagery of hand, means sort of working together. I earlier mentioned a talk given by Archbishop Jean Jadot once at Rice University. His talk was titled The Dialogue of Life. And by that term, he meant something very specific. Here's the way he described it in that talk that day. He said, the real test of dialogue in any community is when Christians and others at the grassroots level profess, put into practice, and teach their children the attitudes about which we've been speaking. It's one of the joys of my work to receive reports from countries around the world which give evidence of creative, deeply felt initiatives between Christians and Muslims, Hindus or Buddhists to share their faith and respect, to work toward reconciliation after conflict, to cooperate in projects of social justice and human development, to search together for ways of making this a world lived according to human and religious principles. People today are calling this the dialogue of life, and it is interreligious encounter at a deep and practical level. And I think myself that poets in particular are gifted at calling our attention to the fact that all the great religious founders taught love and compassion, and that it's in working to make our world more just, humane, and peaceful that we most directly encounter those founders. An American poet named Christopher Jones provides us with a contemporary commentary on the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, the parable about, Lord, when do we see you hungry and feed you? And he put it in his own words in this poem. Do not be afraid to see what is really there. Do not be afraid of the next day, the next hour, the next moment. There he is. Do not be afraid of him. He is a woman old and wrinkled, smelling like wine, dirty, with sneakers and torn sweater and a handbag that's cracked and torn, smoking a just rolled cigarette. Do not be afraid of his language or the looks of him or the smell of him, for he is your God. In other words, it's a matter of seeing Christ in other persons. And I think written in the same spirit and out of a similar awareness of the suffering undergone by so many people in today's world is a following poem from India addressed to the Buddha by a Buddhist poet who wrote as follows. Siddhartha, never do I see you sitting in the lotus position with your eyes closed, or in the caves of Ajanta and Worule with your stony lips touching, sleeping your final sleep. Rather, I see you speaking and walking among the humble and the weak, soothing away grief in the life-threatening darkness, with torch in hand, going from hovel to hovel. Today, you have written a new page of the Tripitaka. You have revealed the new meaning of suffering, which, like an epidemic, is swallowing life's blood. And I do think that all of this opens up possibilities for sharing with members of other faith traditions. Possibilities open even to people not well versed in the beliefs or ritual practices of those other traditions. In fact, this dialogue of the hands may be the most effective way of all to practice interreligious dialogue. One person involved in it once said, the criticism has been made by some that both academic comparative religious studies and interfaith dialogue are no more than elitist experiments in concept weaving. What bearing does all that have on people's lives? Perhaps Christians and Buddhists can encourage each other in a common effort to preserve their highest ideals in such a way that they converge in working together to preserve their living environment. Now, I do think, in what I just quoted, that was an overly negative view of verbal dialogue, but I think we still have to admit that even the most thoroughgoing understanding of another tradition from within, or even the most sincere ability to say with someone like John Moffatt or Raimon Panikar that we feel ourselves to be Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim as well as Christian, that really does count for next to nothing by gospel standards if it's not matched by effective concern shown for the least of Christ's brothers and sisters. Joining with members of other religious traditions in that kind of endeavor could well work wonders in mutual understanding and mutual respect, as well as in self-understanding and self-respect. The possibilities for all this are really endless. I hope all I've done is convinced you really can do a lot to make some of those possibilities real. So those are some of my thoughts on different ways of interreligious dialogue, its importance today, and having patiently listened to me, I'd be happy to hear now some of your own reflections.
Thank you.
Father
Thank you,
James.
Father.
Sure.
Please go ahead, Mike.
Okay.
Oh, everything you talked, Father, resonated with me, especially when you talked about the idea of the double belonging. I am quadruple belonging. I feel a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, a Hindu, and a Buddhist, as well as a Baha'i.
Okay.
There is, I think, the essence of all religions is very similar. If you reach out to the essence of faith, you start feeling this double belonging, or maybe quadruple belonging, whatever you call it. The whole presentation was very enlightening. I just can't appreciate listening to your thoughts out there. And you mentioned about the engagement. You talk about the dialogue of the head, dialogue of the heart, and the dialogue of the hearts. Very well explained. I think all these formats are necessary to carry out a dialogue. And also it resonated with me about the Sufi program that you had at the monastery. And in fact, I'm bringing a Sufi from London, hopefully in April or May. I'll talk to you about, see if you can organize an event with you guys. Mm-hmm. And also I like the phrase you used, descent into the valley of humility. That is such a beautiful sentence. I love that sentence. And I hope with your permission, I'll be using that and giving you credit wherever I can.
Go right ahead. Go right ahead.
I appreciate that. And I want to share Rabbi Gordis, whom I follow. He has written a very beautiful work on dialogue. He says, dialogue has meaning if it respects the autonomy of the other.
Yes.
Meaning you're not looking down upon the other person or looking down on the other's faith. You're just looking to understand his faith or her faith. And then he said, absent that autonomy, we have a monologue. Then we don't have a dialogue. One person is talking, the other person is talking without understanding what was said. And I believe the purpose of dialogue, interfaith dialogue particularly, I've been working on it for 28 years now, is to understand each other and work towards a better environment for everyone. And the essence of all faiths is identical. God wants all his children, all his creation to feel safe and secure. And to achieve that goal, God has brought religion through different religion, or the guidance through different religions, if you may call, for that society to live in the 10 Commandments, what the Quran, the Bible, the Torah says, are all created for one common goal, creating a society where all of God's children feel safe and secure. And I'm very overwhelmed with, I've been trying to see how much can I say about what I learned today. There is so much. I made a few notes, but there are too many. But I will let other people share what they have. But I really appreciate you talking about that. Oh, one more important. There is a chapter in the Quran called Surah Kafirun. It is one of the most beautiful chapters. I use it to teach as in my Center for Pluralism as how to conduct a dialogue, a civil dialogue. In the first line, there are 6 lines in the chapter. The first line says, I don't, when you are conversing with people of other faiths, I don't worship what you worship. And then it says, you don't worship what I worship. In this, there is no denigration or belittling of the other. You are putting both people on the same pedestal. And I need 5 more sentences goes in a similar fashion. Towards the end, it says, to you is your faith, to me is my faith. My faith is dear to me as your faith is dear to you. The entire 6 verses in that chapter in the Quran never puts the other faith down. It puts both on equal dialogue. And that says that is how a dialogue ought to be conducted. The moment, as Rabbi Gordy said, the moment, well, initially you mentioned those people, pagans, or those atheists. When you denigrate them, you cannot have a dialogue with them. You can have a dialogue with them when you respect their autonomy for what they are. When you understand them, they understand you, then you have a dialogue.
Yes.
So I want to salute you again for the great learning about descent into the valley of humility. And I did, and also the dialogue through head, heart, and hands. Thank you, Father.
Okay, sure. You're most welcome. Thank you.
Can I say something too?
Yes, Mr. Nathan.
Sure,
yes.
of course.
First of all, Reverend Wiseman, thank you very much for all of the information you provided tonight. I learned a lot. I'm Muslim too, like Mike, you know, and I want to refer, because you talked about dialogue, I want to refer to beginning of Quran regarding when God was giving Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, his job, what to do, what not to do. He tell him that, you know, we send you to the earth to approve, to seal, to support Moses, I'm sorry, Abraham, Moses, and whatever is in Torah, and also Jesus, and whatever is in Bible. You are both from me, and you are ordered that, you know, to follow them, and you are on the earth to follow them. In the other hand, I cannot be Muslim if I'm not Christian and Jewish too. And then he described that it doesn't matter that if you are Muslim, you are Christian, Jewish, or he says if you pray a star. People are different in the heart, and I know the secret of the people. I mean, they cannot deceive me. In the other hand, in that part, separate the people of every religion. Doesn't matter you are Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or you pray a star. There are 2 kinds of people. The key to the love is sacrifice, he says, because God is the love. The key is sacrifice. Then the people get separated. I mean, he says, I know the secret, they cannot deceive me. In Muslim, in Christian, in Jewish, in Buddhist, or if you pray the star, you are hypocrites that they say I'm Muslim, I'm Christian, I'm Jewish, but in the height, you are different people, and they become your enemy. Like government in Iran, you know, is a Muslim Islamic Republic of Iran. The most hypocrite people, the vicious people that, you know, you have ever imagined in your life. They have massacred 100,000 people since they came to the power. All Muslims. We are 98% Muslim in Iran, 2% are the other religions. But what I'm trying to say that, the base of our dialogue is based on the human law, a human right. If there is 100 people in Iran are massacred, in just 2 months in 1988, the genocide happened, 30,000 people, most of them alive, they were buried in a mass grave. It is Christian job and duty to reveal it and stand in front of it. So the key to the dialogue is sacrifice. The people that sacrifice it, they are Muslim or they are Christian or they are Jewish, they are my brother. If they don't sacrifice, they are not my brother. Because they are, you said, shadow of the death. They bring shadow of the death to the country. They take the law. In Iran, the woman doesn't have no right to get divorced. The woman, if doesn't have a scarf on or doesn't have, they call it hijab, could be executed, which they have been executed. All under the name of the God and all under the name of Islam. So it doesn't matter if they say they are Muslim. They are my first enemy. I am the person that have to give bring the light and life and love to my country. How I can do that is by sacrifice. How I can do that by dialogue with the other religion people, different religion, that people that have different religion, but with the ones that they do sacrifice. Jesus Christ was and is the symbol of sacrifice in the world, because Jesus Christ is spirit of the God. Imagine a spirit is much higher than son of the God. We call it human or God without a spirit is nothing, doesn't exist. We call Jesus the spirit of the God. I mean, we have that much respect for him. He got that much torture that when they nailed him on the cross, he says that he got relief. And thank God for the relief. I mean, nobody has been tortured as much as Jesus got in the world, even during humanity. Nobody. I mean, the key to all of this subject that we talked about tonight is that from tomorrow, you have as a Christian, me as a Muslim, help each other in the right way. If there is in South Africa, they don't respect the human because of his color, is my problem. This South African problem is my problem too, because I am Muslim, because I'm human. And I demand that you put the direction of the program that you have based on practical change in this world. We are I have been against Iranian government, and 24 hours of person that I give my life, my wife, my children, my past. I'm very educated people. The people like me, they decided, they get together and they represent the different Islam, not what Iranian government present. Then you can see the real people that we can work with. You have to find them first. Otherwise, you go to the wrong direction. You never do change, practical change. Thank you very much for
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Nathan, for your reflections. Very much thank you, Father, for your time and for your, it's very precious what change it can bring.